The parking lot was eerily quiet when 4 police officers approached the sleek black Dodge Charger. Its windows were tinted, and the license plate was local, giving no clue of who was inside. Officers Daniels and Brody, the leaders of the squad, exchanged a knowing smirk. "This one's gonna be fun," Daniels whispered. They banged on the driver's window. Slowly, the glass rolled down, revealing a well-dressed black man in his early 40s. His face was calm, but his sharp eyes seemed to assess every detail of the 4 officers. "Evening, gentlemen," he said in a deep, steady voice. "Step out of the car," Brody barked. The man tilted his head, his eyebrows raised in mild surprise. "Is there a problem, officer?" "Don't make this harder than it has to be," Daniels snapped, his hand already resting on his holstered weapon. With a quiet sigh, the man stepped out of the car. He was tall and muscular, his tailored suit fitting him perfectly. As he moved, the glint of an expensive watch caught the officer's attention. "Nice suit," Brody sneered. "Where'd you steal it?" The man didn't respond, but the faintest flicker of irritation crossed his face. That was all the officers needed. Before he could say a word, Daniels roughly spun him around and slammed him against the car hood. The man winced but remained silent. "What's your name?" one of the other officers, Smith, demanded. "Jacob," he replied evenly. "Jacob what?" "Jacob Carter." "Well, Jacob Carter," Daniels said, tightening the cuffs painfully around Jacob's wrists, "you're under arrest." "For what?" Jacob asked, his voice still calm but colder now. Brody laughed. "For being suspicious, that's what. You fit the profile." "What profile might that be?" Jacob asked, his tone sharp enough to make Daniels pause for a moment. "The you know exactly what we mean profile," Daniels spat. As the officers began dragging him toward their squad car, Jacob finally spoke again, his tone cutting through the air like a knife. "I'd rethink this if I were you." Daniels chuckled. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Jacob turned his head slightly, locking eyes with him. His calm demeanor was gone, replaced with a look that froze Daniels mid-step. "You really have no idea who I am, do you?" Daniels hesitated, glancing at Brody, who shrugged dismissively. But something in Jacob's voice sent a ripple of unease through the group. Brody, determined to keep control, yanked Jacob forward. "We don't care who you are," he said. "You're going downtown." As Jacob was shoved into the back of the squad car, Daniels pulled out his radio to call it in. That's when Jacob leaned forward, his voice dripping with quiet menace. "Before you make that call," he said, "you might want to check your badges. And your careers." Daniels froze, his thumb hovering over the radio button. Brody and the others exchanged uneasy glances. Something about this man wasn't right, but it was too late to back out now. 2 hours earlier, Jacob had been in a high-rise office overlooking downtown Chicago. He was briefing a team of federal agents about an ongoing investigation into a powerful drug cartel. As a senior DEA agent, Jacob was known for his no-nonsense approach and his uncanny ability to dismantle criminal organizations from the inside out. The case he was working on had been particularly dangerous, involving corrupt officials and violent enforcers. To stay under the radar, Jacob often traveled alone, blending into the background while gathering critical intelligence. Earlier that evening, he'd stopped at a convenience store near the outskirts of town to grab a coffee before heading to meet a contact. He noticed the 4 officers loitering outside but thought nothing of it, until he saw their eyes following him as he walked back to his car. Jacob had learned to trust his instincts. Something about their stares felt off. But he kept his cool, got into his car, and drove to a nearby parking lot to wait for his contact. It wasn't long before the police cruiser pulled in behind him, its lights flashing. Back in the present, as the squad car sped toward the precinct, Jacob sat silently in the back seat. The officers were tense, their earlier bravado replaced with an undercurrent of doubt. "What do you think he meant by that?" Smith finally asked. "Doesn't matter," Brody snapped. "He's just trying to scare us." Daniels, gripping the wheel tighter, wasn't so sure. Something about Jacob's composure, even in cuffs, unsettled him. Just as they reached the precinct, Daniels' radio crackled to life. The voice on the other end was sharp and urgent. "Unit 34, what's your status? We've got a report of..." "Wait. Who did you just bring in?" Daniels frowned. "Just some guy we picked up." There was a long pause on the other end before the voice returned, this time tinged with panic. "Did he tell you his name?" Daniels hesitated. "Yeah. Jacob Carter." The silence that followed was deafening. Then the voice came back, now filled with disbelief. "Let him go. Right now." Daniel's blood ran cold. "What? Why?" "Because," the voice said, "you just arrested a DEA agent." Daniels froze, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as the words sank in. "DEA agent?" His mind raced, trying to process the situation. Brody leaned forward from the passenger seat, his voice laced with confusion. "What was that? Did they say DEA agent?" Daniels nodded stiffly, his face pale. In the back seat, Jacob remained calm, watching their reactions with a quiet intensity. He didn't say a word, but his eyes seemed to pierce through the tension building in the car. "What do we do?" Smith asked nervously from the back. "We've already booked him. We can't just let him go now." Daniels swallowed hard, his throat dry. "We get him inside, figure out what's going on." "You heard the radio." Brody snapped. "They said to let him go. And look like idiots." Daniels shot back. "No way. We're handling this." The car pulled into the precinct parking lot, and the officers exchanged uneasy glances. Brody opened the door to pull Jacob out, but his hands trembled slightly. Jacob stepped out on his own, his movements smooth and controlled. "Let me save you some trouble," Jacob said, his voice calm but cold. "Call your superior. Now." Daniels ignored him, gripping Jacob's arm tightly as they escorted him inside. The precinct was bustling, with officers moving in and out, phones ringing, and the murmur of conversations filling the air. Jacob's presence drew attention almost immediately. "Who's that?" a young officer at the front desk asked, frowning. "Just someone we picked up," Daniels muttered, steering Jacob toward an interrogation room. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Jacob sat calmly in the chair, his cuffed hands resting on the table. Daniels leaned against the wall, trying to maintain his composure. Brody stood by the door, arms crossed, while Smith and the fourth officer, Green, lingered uncomfortably. "Start talking," Daniels demanded. "Who are you really?" Jacob tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I already told you. I'm Jacob Carter. You think we're stupid?" Brody snapped. "The radio said you're D." Jacob didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smirk playing on his lips. "You could have avoided all this," he said quietly. "But now, you've made it a lot worse for yourselves." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" Jacob's smirk disappeared, replaced by a steely gaze that made Daniels take an involuntary step back. "I think you've made a mistake you're not prepared to deal with," Jacob replied. An hour earlier, Jacob's contact had sent a text delaying their meeting. Knowing he had time to kill, Jacob stayed in the parking lot, reviewing his case notes. He was deep in thought when the flashing lights appeared behind him. He'd dealt with situations like this before. As a black man in law enforcement, he was painfully aware of how he could be perceived. But this time felt different. The officer's demeanor wasn't just about suspicion or protocol, it was about intimidation. Jacob had hoped his calm, professional demeanor would de-escalate the situation. Instead, it seemed to fuel their aggression. Now, sitting in the precinct, he wondered how far they were willing to take this. Back in the interrogation room, the tension was palpable. Brody paced back and forth, his frustration mounting. Smith and Green exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "This is ridiculous," Brody muttered. "He's bluffing. No way he's do." "Then call my bluff," Jacob said smoothly. Daniels hesitated. The confidence in Jacob's tone was unnerving. Finally, he pulled out his phone and stepped into the hallway, dialing the number for the precinct captain. "Captain Williams," a gruff voice answered. "Sir, we have a situation," Daniels began. "We brought in a suspect, and the radio said he's DEA. His name is Jacob Carter." There was a long pause on the other end. When the captain spoke again, his voice was sharp and commanding. "Listen to me very carefully. Do not touch him. Do not question him. Sit tight until I get there." "But sir." "I mean it, Daniels. If you've laid a finger on him, you're already in deep trouble." The line went dead, and Daniels felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. He returned to the interrogation room, his expression grim. "What did he say?" Brody asked. Daniels didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to Jacob, his voice unsteady. "You're free to go." Brody's eyes widened. What? You can't be serious. I said he's free to go. Daniels snapped, his voice cracking. Jacob stood slowly, the faintest hint of satisfaction flickering across his face. As Daniels unlocked the cuffs, Jacob leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. You think this is over, he said. It's not. Daniels flinched, stepping back as Jacob walked out of the room, leaving the officers in stunned silence. As Jacob exited the precinct, the captain's car pulled into the parking lot, tires screeching to a halt. Captain Williams stepped out, his face a mix of anger and panic. He hurried toward the building, his eyes scanning the scene. Jacob stopped, watching him approach. He knew the captain's arrival would set off a chain of events that these officers weren't ready for. But for now, he was content to leave them sweating. Inside the precinct, Daniels and his team were beginning to realize the gravity of their mistake. Do you think he'll file a report? Smith asked nervously. File a report? Brody scoffed. He's DA. He'll bury us. Daniels didn't respond. He was too busy staring at the door, wondering what would happen next. The air in the precinct grew heavier as Captain Williams stormed inside. His presence was commanding, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for prey. Officers stepped out of his way, sensing the storm brewing beneath his sharp glare. Daniels and his team froze as Williams approached, his jaw clenched, his fists tight at his sides. Where is he? Williams barked. Daniels gestured weakly toward the exit. He just left. The captain's nostrils flared, and he took a moment to steady his breath. Do you have any idea what you've done? His voice was quiet, which only made it more menacing. Brody, still defensive, crossed his arms. We were just doing our job. Your job. Williams snapped, his voice rising. Your job is to enforce the law, not make a mockery of it. Do you even know who Jacob Carter is? The officers exchanged uneasy glances. Daniels finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. DEA agent. Senior DEA agent, Williams corrected, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. One of the best in the agency. And you just arrested him. For what? Fun. Brody bristled at the accusation. He was acting suspicious. Williams slammed his hand on a nearby desk, silencing him. Enough. His voice echoed through the precinct, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Do you have any idea how much damage this could do? To this department? To your careers? Daniel swallowed hard, the weight of the situation crashing down on him. What do we do now? You pray, Williams said coldly. You pray that Agent Carter is feeling generous, because if he's not, he didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. Outside, Jacob stood by his car, his hands resting on the roof as he stared at the precinct. He wasn't angry. He was furious. But he'd learned long ago to channel that anger into something productive. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. Carter, a voice answered on the other end. It's me, Jacob said. We have a situation. What kind of situation? Jacob glanced back at the precinct, his jaw tightening. The kind that needs to be documented. Understood, the voice replied. We'll take care of it. Jacob ended the call and got into his car, his mind racing. This wasn't the first time he'd been targeted for his skin color, but it was the first time it had happened so brazenly, with such an air of smug entitlement. He wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. As he drove away, his phone buzzed with a text. It was his contact, confirming a new meeting time. Jacob sighed. The cartel case was critical, but now he had another mission, to ensure that those officers were held accountable. Back at the precinct, the tension was palpable. Williams stood before Daniels, Brody, Smith, and Green, his arms crossed as he glared at each of them in turn. This is what's going to happen, Williams said. You're going to write up a full report on what happened tonight. Every detail. No lies, no omissions. And when Agent Carter files his complaint, which he will, I'm going to hand him those reports personally. Do you understand me? Daniels nodded reluctantly, his face pale. Brody, however, wasn't ready to back down. With all due respect, Captain, aren't we overreacting? He's just one guy. Williams' eyes narrowed dangerously. He's not just one guy, Brody. He's a federal agent. And if you think for 1 second that this is going to blow over, you're a bigger fool than I thought. Brody opened his mouth to respond, but Williams cut him off. Save it. Just write the damn report. As the captain turned to leave, the phone at the front desk rang. The young officer on duty answered, her eyes widening as she listened. Captain Williams, she called out hesitantly. What is it? Williams asked. It's for you, she said, holding out the phone. They said it's urgent. Williams took the receiver, his brow furrowing. This is Captain Williams. Captain, this is Director Barnes with the DEA, the voice on the other end said. We need to talk about what happened tonight. Williams' stomach sank. Yes, sir. I can explain. No need, Barnes said curtly. Agent Carter already informed us. We're sending someone to your precinct to handle the situation. Williams' grip on the phone tightened. Handle it how? That's not for you to worry about, Barnes replied. But let's just say this isn't going to end well for your officers. The line went dead, leaving Williams staring at the phone in disbelief. Slowly, he turned to face Daniels and his team. You're in for a long night, he said grimly. Jacob arrived at the meeting spot, a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of town. His contact was already there, a wiry man in his 50s with a weathered face and sharp eyes. Rough night? The contact asked as Jacob slid into the booth. You could say that, Jacob replied, his tone clipped. Cops, the contact guessed. Jacob nodded. 4 of them. Thought they'd have a little fun. The contact shook his head. Idiots. Jacob leaned forward, his expression serious. Do you have the intel? The contact slid a folder across the table. Everything you need. But you should know, they're getting nervous. The cartel's starting to suspect someone's onto them. Let them, Jacob said, his voice cold. They'll slip up soon enough. The contact hesitated. You sure you're okay? You seem off. Jacob forced a small smile. I'm fine. Just a little detour tonight. The contact nodded, though he didn't seem convinced. Be careful, Carter. These guys don't play around. Jacob pocketed the folder and stood. Neither do I. Back at the precinct, Daniels, Brody, Smith, and Green sat in a small conference room, each of them staring at the blank report forms in front of them. The gravity of their actions was finally sinking in, but it was too late to undo the damage. What do you think they'll do to us? Smith asked nervously. Brody scowled. Probably slap us on the wrist and send us back out there. It's not like we killed the guy. Daniels shook his head. This isn't going away, Brody. You heard the captain. This is serious. Before anyone could respond, the door opened, and Captain Williams stepped inside, his face grim. Pack it up, he said. You're all suspended until further notice. What? Brody exclaimed, leaping to his feet. You can't do that. I can, and I just did, Williams said sharply. Now get out of my sight. As the officers filed out, Daniels lingered behind, his face etched with worry. Captain, do you really think he'll come after us? Williams sighed. If I were him, I wouldn't stop until I burned this place to the ground. Jacob parked his car in the driveway of his suburban home, the glow of the porch light illuminating his tense features. He sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as he replayed the night's events in his mind. The anger he had suppressed throughout the ordeal began to bubble to the surface, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He knew better than anyone how to play the long game. Inside, his wife Vanessa was waiting for him in the living room. She looked up from her laptop, her brow furrowing when she saw his expression. Rough night, she asked, closing the device and rising to greet him. You could say that, Jacob replied, kissing her on the cheek. Vanessa studied him closely. She had seen him angry before, but this was different. There was a quiet intensity about him that set her on edge. What happened? Jacob hesitated, weighing how much to tell her. She was his rock, his partner in everything, but he hated burdening her with the uglier parts of his job. Finally, he sat down on the couch and rubbed his temples. I got pulled over by some cops, he said. They thought I was suspicious. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. Suspicious how? Jacob looked up at her, his expression grim. Suspicious for being black in a nice car. Vanessa's face hardened. She had heard stories like this before, but hearing it from her husband made her blood boil. What did they do? Jacob recounted the incident in careful detail, his tone steady but laced with underlying anger. Vanessa sat beside him, her fists clenched as she listened. And they didn't know who you were, she asked when he finished. Not until their captain got a call from the DEA, Jacob replied. Even then, they tried to cover their tracks. Vanessa shook her head in disbelief. Unbelievable. So what happens now? Jacob leaned back, his jaw tightening. Now, I make sure they face the consequences. I've already contacted the agency. They'll launch an investigation, but I'm not stopping there. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's ever been harassed by cops like them. Vanessa reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly. Whatever you need to do, I'm with you. Jacob nodded, his resolve solidifying. He wasn't just going to let this slide. Not this time. At the precinct, the fallout from the night's events was spreading quickly. The news of the officer's suspension had sent shockwaves through the department, with whispers and rumors circulating among the staff. Daniel sat in the locker room, staring blankly at his open locker. His uniform hung inside, a stark reminder of what was at stake. He felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him, but he couldn't bring himself to admit he had been wrong. Brody stormed in, his face red with anger. This is ridiculous. Suspended? For what? Doing our jobs. Doing our jobs? Daniels echoed bitterly. Is that what you call it? Brody scowled. Oh, don't start with me, Daniels. You were right there with us. Daniel sighed, leaning his head against the cool metal of the locker. Yeah, I was. And now look where it got us. Meanwhile, Jacob was back at his office, poring over files related to the cartel case. He tried to focus, but the events of the night kept creeping into his thoughts. His phone buzzed on the desk, and he picked it up to see a message from an unknown number. We're sorry for what happened tonight. It shouldn't have gone down that way. Jacob frowned, his thumb hovering over the screen. The message was unsigned, but he had a good idea who it was from. He debated whether to respond but decided against it. Instead, he set the phone down and returned to his work. The cartel case was heating up. His contacts' intel pointed to a major shipment coming in within the next 48 hours, and Jacob needed to be ready. But even as he strategized, his mind lingered on the precinct and the officers who had crossed the line. Back at the precinct, Captain Williams was on the phone with a representative from the DEA. The conversation was tense, with Williams trying to salvage what little dignity the department had left. We're taking this very seriously, Williams said, pacing his office. The officers involved have been suspended, and we're cooperating fully with your investigation. The voice on the other end was calm but firm. That's a start, Captain, but it's not enough. Agent Carter is one of our best, and what happened tonight is unacceptable. We'll be conducting our own inquiry, and we expect full transparency from your department. Of course, Williams said quickly. You'll have our full cooperation. As the call ended, Williams sank into his chair, running a hand through his hair. He knew the DA wouldn't stop until heads rolled, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The next day, Jacob was meeting with his supervisor, a seasoned agent named Alan Rivera. Rivera was known for his no-nonsense approach and his fierce loyalty to his team. This isn't just about you, Jacob, Rivera said as they sat in his office. This is about the entire agency. If word gets out that one of our agents was targeted like this, it's going to raise questions. And not just about the cops involved. Jacob frowned. What are you saying? I'm saying the DEA doesn't like bad press, Rivera replied. They'll want to handle this quietly, minimize the fallout. Jacob's jaw tightened. So they're just going to sweep it under the rug? Rivera shook his head. Not if I have anything to say about it. But you need to be smart about this. Don't let your anger cloud your judgment. Jacob nodded, though his frustration was evident. He had always admired Rivera's level-headedness, but this was personal. He wasn't going to let it slide, no matter how much the agency wanted to downplay it. That night, as Jacob prepared to leave the office, he received another text from the unknown number. We messed up. I want to talk. Alone. Jacob stared at the message, his mind racing. Was this a trap? Or was it genuine? He debated whether to respond, weighing the risks. Finally, he typed out a reply. Where? The response came almost immediately. The parking lot. Midnight. Jacob sighed, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't part of the plan, but his curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed his jacket and headed out, his mind already preparing for whatever was about to unfold. As he drove toward the meeting spot, He couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen. Jacob arrived at the parking lot a few minutes before midnight. The area was dimly lit, with only a couple of flickering streetlights casting long shadows across the asphalt. He parked his car at the edge of the lot, leaving the engine running as he scanned his surroundings. The lot was nearly empty, save for a single vehicle parked in the far corner, a beat-up pickup truck that looked out of place. Jacob reached into his glove compartment, pulling out his sidearm and tucking it into the holster beneath his jacket. He wasn't about to walk into an ambush unprepared. Stepping out of the car, he made his way toward the truck, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. As he approached, the driver's side door opened, and Officer Daniels stepped out, his hands raised slightly to show he wasn't armed. "You're alone?" Jacob asked, his voice calm but firm. Daniels nodded. "Yeah, just me." Jacob didn't relax. "What do you want?" Daniels hesitated, his expression a mixture of guilt and unease. "I came to apologize." Jacob raised an eyebrow, crossing his arms. "Apologize? That's rich. You didn't seem sorry when you were shoving me into the back of your squad car." Daniels winced. "I know. I messed up. We all did. I couldn't let it sit. I had to say something." Jacob studied him, searching for any sign of deceit. "Why now? Your captain already suspended you. What's the point?" Daniel sighed, lowering his hands. "Because I'm not like Brody. I know what we did was wrong, and I don't want it to define me. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I needed you to hear it from me." Jacob stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke, his tone icy. "You think saying, sorry, makes this better? Do you have any idea how many men like you I've dealt with? Men who think they can do whatever they want, just because they have a badge." Daniels looked down, unable to meet Jacob's gaze. "I know. And I know I don't have an excuse. I just wanted you to know that I regret what happened." Jacob took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Regret doesn't fix anything. But if you're serious about making this right, you'll cooperate with the investigation. No lies, no cover-ups. Understand?" Daniels nodded quickly. "I will. Whatever you need." Jacob studied him for another moment before stepping back. "Then we're done here. Don't contact me again unless it's through official channels." Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but thought better of it. He nodded once more, climbed back into his truck, and drove off, leaving Jacob standing alone in the parking lot. As Jacob drove home, his mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Daniel's apology felt genuine, but it didn't erase the anger he felt. It didn't erase the humiliation. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to push the emotions aside. He had bigger things to focus on. The cartel case was closing in, and he couldn't afford any distractions. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Brody sat at a bar across the street, nursing a beer. He had been drinking for hours, his anger simmering just below the surface. He wasn't used to being called out for his actions, and he resented the fact that Daniels had caved so easily. "They're making a big deal out of nothing," Brody muttered, slamming his empty glass on the counter. The bartender raised an eyebrow but said nothing, sliding another drink his way. Brody took a long swig, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the image of Jacob's calm, unflinching demeanor. It infuriated him. "I'm not letting some hotshot DEA agent ruin my career," he muttered under his breath. Brody pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he was looking for. After a brief hesitation, he dialed. "Yeah, it's me," he said when the call connected. "We need to talk." The next morning, Jacob was back in the office, reviewing the latest intel on the cartel. His team was gearing up for a raid, and tensions were high. Rivera entered the room, his expression serious. "Carter," Rivera said, motioning for him to follow. "We've got a problem." Jacob stood, following Rivera into a small conference room. Once the door was closed, Rivera handed him a file. Jacob opened it, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the contents. "Brody," Jacob muttered, recognizing the officer's name immediately. "What's this?" "Internal Affairs flagged some unusual activity," Rivera explained. "Brody's been making calls to known associates of the cartel." Jacob's jaw tightened. "You think he's working with them?" "It's possible," Rivera said grimly. "Or he's trying to cover his tracks after what happened with you. Either way, it's a problem." Jacob closed the file, his mind racing. This changed everything. If Brody was involved with the cartel, it wasn't just a matter of bad policing, it was a matter of national security. What's the play? Jacob asked. Rivera leaned against the table, his expression tense. We watch him. See where it leads. But if he's working with the cartel, we'll need solid evidence before we make a move. Jacob nodded, already formulating a plan. The cartel was dangerous, but so was a rogue cop with something to hide. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about survival. That night, as Jacob prepared for the next phase of the investigation, his phone buzzed with another message. This time, the sender wasn't unknown. It was Rivera. Brody just left a known cartel hideout. I think it's time we paid him a visit. Jacob stared at the message, his heart pounding. This was the break they'd been waiting for. But as he grabbed his jacket and headed out the door, a sense of unease settled over him. He knew this confrontation wasn't going to end quietly. And he was right. Jacob arrived at the designated meeting point, a nondescript warehouse just outside the city. The night was still, but the air was charged with tension. Rivera was already there, waiting in an unmarked car with another agent, Ramirez. Brody's inside, Rivera said as Jacob slid into the back seat. We've been monitoring him for the past hour. He's meeting with a high-level cartel associate. Jacob frowned. What's he doing there? A cop showing up at a cartel hideout isn't exactly subtle. Ramirez spoke up, his tone grim. We think he's panicking. He's trying to broker some kind of deal, probably to protect himself. Jacob's mind raced. Brody's arrogance and reckless behavior made him dangerous, but desperation made him unpredictable. What's the plan? Rivera handed him a set of surveillance photos taken earlier in the night. Brody was clearly visible, shaking hands with a man Jacob recognized immediately, Hector Alvarez, the cartel's second-in-command. We wait until Brody leaves, Rivera said. Then we move in. If he's working with the cartel, we need to catch him in the act. Jacob studied the photos, his jaw tightening. And if he doesn't leave? Then we take them both, Rivera said firmly. No more games. Inside the warehouse, Brody was pacing nervously, his phone clutched in his hand. Alvarez stood by a table covered in stacks of cash and packages of drugs, watching him with a faint smirk. You're late, Alvarez said, his voice smooth and cold. I had to make sure I wasn't followed, Brody replied, his eyes darting toward the windows. Alvarez chuckled. Relax, officer. If someone was following you, they'd be dead by now. Brody swallowed hard, his nerves clearly fraying. Look, I need your help. Things are getting complicated. Alvarez raised an eyebrow. Complicated how? That dear guy, Brody said, his voice dropping to a whisper. Carter. He's on to me. And if he starts digging, he's gonna find out more than I can cover up. Alvarez's smirk widened. So, you're asking for protection? I'm asking for a way out, Brody snapped. I've done enough for you. You owe me. Alvarez's expression darkened. Owe you? I don't owe you anything, officer. If anything, you owe me. You've been very sloppy lately, and I don't like loose ends. Brody stiffened, his hand inching toward the gun at his hip. Alvarez noticed and laughed, shaking his head. Calm down. If I wanted you dead, you'd already be on the floor. Brody's hand froze, but the tension in the room was palpable. So what now? Now, Alvarez said, his tone icy, you do exactly what I tell you. Or you find out what happens to people who disappoint me. Outside, Jacob, Rivera, and Ramirez watched as Brody's car pulled out of the warehouse and onto the deserted street. Ramirez started the engine, following at a safe distance. He's heading west, Ramirez said, his eyes on the taillights. Looks like he's going back into the city. Jacob stared at the car ahead, his mind racing. What about Alvarez? Are we just letting him walk? For now, Rivera said. We can't risk blowing our cover. We'll deal with him later. As they followed Brody, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Brody was reckless, but he wasn't stupid. He had to know the DEA was closing in on him. Why would he risk meeting Alvarez now? Where's he going? Jacob muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Let's find out, Rivera replied. Brody pulled into a quiet residential neighborhood, parking his car outside a small rundown house. Jacob and the others parked a block away, watching as Brody entered the house. That's not his place, Ramirez said, checking the address against their records. Belongs to a guy named Victor Morales. Small-time dealer with ties to the cartel. Then why's Brody here? Jacob asked, his instincts tingling. We'll find out soon enough, Rivera said. Let's move. The three agents exited the car, approaching the house cautiously. Jacob took the lead, his weapon drawn as they positioned themselves near the front door. Rivera nodded, signaling for Jacob to proceed. Jacob knocked sharply, his voice firm. DA. Open up. Inside, Brody froze. His eyes darted to Morales, who was sitting at a table counting cash. Don't open it, Brody hissed. But Morales, panicked, bolted for the back door. Ramirez was waiting, tackling him to the ground as Rivera and Jacob burst through the front. Hands where I can see them. Jacob barked, his weapon trained on Brody. Brody raised his hand slowly, his face a mask of defiance. This is entrapment, he snarled. You have no idea what you're doing. Save it, Jacob said coldly. You're done. Rivera cuffed Brody while Jacob secured the scene, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of cartel involvement. On the table, he spotted a small, encrypted laptop. He picked it up, his gut telling him it was important. You have no idea what you're messing with, Brody said as Rivera led him toward the door. You think this ends with me? You're in over your head, Carter. Jacob didn't respond, but his mind was already racing. Brody's words weren't just bluster, they were a warning. And Jacob knew he couldn't ignore them. Back at the DEA office, Jacob and Rivera reviewed the contents of the laptop. It didn't take long for them to find something shocking, a series of emails between Brody and high-ranking cartel members, outlining not just their partnership, but detailed plans for an upcoming shipment. This is big, Rivera said, his voice laced with excitement. If we can intercept that shipment, we'll cripple the cartel. Jacob nodded, his focus sharpening. Then we don't waste any time. We need to move on this. But even as they strategized, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the cartel was already one step ahead. And Brody's parting words lingered in his mind, a chilling reminder that the danger was far from over. The DEA office buzzed with activity as Jacob and Rivera worked to mobilize a task force. The intel from Brody's laptop painted a clear picture. A massive cartel shipment was set to arrive in less than 24 hours. If intercepted, it would deal a significant blow to their operations. Jacob's focus was razor-sharp. While his run-in with Brody and the other officers still lingered in his mind, the mission took precedence. Yet, he couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that the cartel had more cards to play. We've got teams stationed at all known entry points, Rivera said, pointing to a map on the wall. The shipment's coming through the docks. If we time this right, we can catch them before they even unload. Jacob nodded. And Brody? He's in custody, Rivera replied. But he's not talking. He knows anything he says will bury him deeper. Jacob stared at the map, his jaw tightening. He doesn't have to talk. We've got the emails, and we've got Morales. Between the two, we'll piece this together. Rivera clapped Jacob on the shoulder. You've got good instincts, Carter. Let's bring this home. Meanwhile, in a secure holding cell, Brody sat alone, his face pale but his eyes burning with anger. He had underestimated Jacob, and now he was paying the price. But Brody wasn't the type to go down quietly. The sound of approaching footsteps caught his attention. A guard appeared outside the cell, unlocking the door. You've got a visitor, the guard said. Brody frowned. A lawyer. The guard shook his head. Not exactly. Brody's confusion deepened as a tall man in a dark suit entered the room. His face was sharp, his demeanor calm, but there was something about him that radiated danger. Officer Brody, the man said, his voice smooth and deliberate. We need to talk. Brody leaned back, his defenses up. Who the hell are you? The man smiled faintly. Let's just say I represent certain interests. Interests that are very unhappy with the situation you've created. Brody's blood ran cold. He didn't need to ask who the man was talking about. I didn't say anything, Brody blurted. I swear. I know, the man replied. But that doesn't mean you're off the hook. You've made a mess, and now you're going to fix it. How? Brody asked, his voice trembling. The man leaned in closer, his smile fading. By doing exactly what I tell you. If you don't, let's just say your problems will be the least of your worries. Back at the DEA office, The task force was finalizing plans for the raid. Jacob was reviewing the intel when Ramirez approached, holding a phone. "It's Morales," Ramirez said. "He's ready to talk." Jacob followed Ramirez to the interrogation room, where Victor Morales sat, his hands cuffed and his face drawn. He looked up as Jacob entered, a mixture of fear and desperation in his eyes. "Mr. Morales," Jacob said, sitting across from him. "You've got information we need. Help us, and we might be able to help you." Morales nodded quickly. "I don't want to die, man. I'll tell you what you want to know." "Good," Jacob said. "Start with the shipment." Morales hesitated, glancing around the room as if expecting someone to burst in. "It's coming in at Dock 14. Midnight. But there's something else." "What?" Jacob asked, his tone sharp. "They know," Morales whispered. "They know you're coming." Jacob stiffened. "How?" "I don't know," Morales said quickly. "But Alvarez has connections everywhere. He's planning something big. If you go in there blind, it's a trap." Jacob exchanged a look with Ramirez. Morales seemed genuine, but it was impossible to tell if he was holding anything back. "Anything else?" Jacob pressed. Morales hesitated again, then nodded. "There's someone on the inside. A cop. Not just Brody, someone higher up. Alvarez trusts him." Jacob's stomach dropped. Another corrupt officer? This was worse than he thought. That evening, the task force gathered for a final briefing. Jacob relayed Morales' warning, and the team adjusted their strategy accordingly. They couldn't risk walking into an ambush. "Stay sharp," Jacob said as the team geared up. "If they know we're coming, they'll be ready. We need to be faster." Rivera nodded. "Let's move." The convoy of vehicles rolled out, heading toward the docks. The tension in the air was palpable as the agents prepared for what could be their most dangerous mission yet. At Dock 14, the scene was eerily quiet. The massive shipping containers cast long shadows under the dim lights, and the only sounds were the distant hum of machinery and the lapping of water against the pier. Jacob and his team moved in silently, their weapons drawn. They had the element of surprise, for now. As they approached the designated area, Jacob spotted movement near one of the containers. He signaled for the team to halt, then crept closer, his heart pounding. Inside the container, a group of cartel members was unloading crates. Alvarez was there, overseeing the operation with a smug expression. But something felt off. "Wait," Jacob whispered into his radio. "There's something wrong." Before he could say anything else, a deafening explosion rocked the dock. The container next to them erupted in flames, sending debris flying. Jacob was thrown to the ground, his ears ringing. "It's a trap!" Rivera shouted over the chaos. Gunfire erupted from all directions as cartel members emerged from the shadows, firing at the agents. Jacob scrambled for cover, his mind racing. "Regroup," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Hold your positions." The docks had turned into a war zone, with bullets flying and agents returning fire. Jacob could see Alvarez retreating toward a waiting vehicle, his smug smile replaced with cold determination. "We can't let him get away," Jacob yelled, signaling for Ramirez to follow him. As they moved toward Alvarez, Jacob's radio crackled to life. It was Rivera. "Carter, we've got another problem," Rivera said, his voice tense. "Brody's out. Someone helped him escape." Jacob's blood ran cold. "What?" "He's gone," Rivera repeated. "And if Morales was right, he's not done yet." Jacob gritted his teeth, his mind racing. Between the ambush, the cartel, and Brody's escape, the stakes had just skyrocketed. He didn't know how, but he was determined to bring them all down, starting with Alvarez. The fight was far from over. The docks were chaos. Flames from the explosion illuminated the night, casting jagged shadows against the shipping containers. The cacophony of gunfire, shouting, and the crackling blaze made communication difficult. Jacob crouched behind a steel barrier, his heart racing as he scanned the scene for Alvarez. Through the smoke, he spotted the cartel leader slipping into a black SUV. The engine roared to life, and the vehicle began to speed away, its taillights glowing like angry eyes in the darkness. "He's getting away," Jacob shouted into his radio. "Ramirez with me," he added, breaking cover and sprinting toward the dock's edge, where his vehicle was parked. Ramirez was right behind him, dodging bullets as they moved. Rivera's voice crackled over the radio. "Carter, we're pinned down. Don't chase him alone. Jacob didn't respond. He knew Rivera was right, but letting Alvarez escape wasn't an option. He jumped into the driver's seat of his unmarked car, Ramirez sliding into the passenger seat, her rifle ready. Go, go, go. Ramirez urged. Jacob slammed his foot on the gas, the tires screeching as they sped out of the docks in pursuit of the SUV. Ahead, Alvarez's vehicle weaved through the industrial roads, its driver clearly skilled at evasion. They've got a head start, Ramirez said, her voice tense. Not for long, Jacob muttered, his grip tightening on the wheel. Back at the docks, Rivera and the remaining agents were regrouping. The cartel's ambush had been brutal, but the DEA task force was holding their ground. Several cartel members had been apprehended, and backup was en route. Where's Carter? Rivera demanded, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene. Went after Alvarez, an agent replied. Ramirez is with him. Rivera swore under his breath. Damn it, Carter. You better know what you're doing. On the road, Jacob and Ramirez closed the gap between their car and Alvarez's SUV. The cartel leader's driver was good, taking sharp turns and weaving through narrow streets, but Jacob was relentless. As they entered a more residential area, the SUV suddenly swerved, knocking over trash cans and narrowly avoiding parked cars. Jacob realized Alvarez was heading toward a side street that would lead back to the highway. Not happening, Jacob muttered. He turned the wheel sharply, cutting through an alleyway to intercept the SUV. The move paid off. Jacob's car emerged just as the SUV barreled out of the side street, forcing the driver to slam on the brakes. Block him in. Ramirez shouted. Jacob maneuvered the car to block the SUV's path, forcing it to stop. The doors of the SUV flew open, and Alvarez's men jumped out, guns drawn. Jacob and Ramirez ducked as bullets riddled their windshield. Stay low, Jacob ordered, grabbing his sidearm. From his crouched position, Jacob returned fire, aiming for the tires of the SUV. A loud pop signaled that he'd hit his target, immobilizing the vehicle. Ramirez leaned out her window, her rifle barking as she took down one of Alvarez's men. Alvarez himself emerged from the SUV, using the chaos to slip away into a nearby alley. Jacob spotted him and yelled to Ramirez, "Cover me!" Without waiting for a response, Jacob bolted after Alvarez, his gun drawn. The alley was dark and narrow, filled with the stench of garbage and the sound of distant sirens. Alvarez was fast, but Jacob was faster. "Stop!" Jacob shouted, his voice echoing off the brick walls. Alvarez didn't stop. He rounded a corner, pulling a handgun from his waistband. Jacob saw the glint of metal and dove for cover as Alvarez fired. The bullets missed, ricocheting off a dumpster. "You're not getting away, Alvarez!" Jacob shouted, his voice hard. Alvarez laughed, a cruel sound that sent chills down Jacob's spine. "You don't know what you're up against, Carter." Jacob ignored the taunt, moving carefully through the shadows. He caught a glimpse of Alvarez slipping through a chain-link fence at the end of the alley. Jacob sprinted after him, vaulting over the fence with ease. On the other side, Alvarez was waiting, his gun aimed directly at Jacob. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Jacob stared down the barrel of the gun, his mind racing. But Alvarez hesitated, his hand trembling. Before he could fire, Ramirez appeared behind him, her rifle aimed at his back. "Drop it, Alvarez!" Ramirez barked. Alvarez froze, his eyes darting between Jacob and Ramirez. Slowly, he lowered his gun and let it fall to the ground. Jacob exhaled sharply, stepping forward to cuff Alvarez. "You're done," he said coldly. Alvarez smirked, his composure returning. "You think this ends with me? You're just scratching the surface." Jacob tightened the cuffs, his jaw clenched. "We'll see about that." Back at the DEA office, Jacob and Ramirez delivered Alvarez into custody. Rivera was waiting, his expression a mixture of relief and frustration. "You pulled it off," Rivera said. "But next time, don't go rogue." Jacob shrugged. "Sometimes, you have to take risks." Rivera shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're lucky it paid off. Alvarez is a big catch, but this isn't over. If what Morales said is true, we've got a bigger problem." Jacob nodded, his mind already racing. The cartel's network was vast, and Alvarez's capture would send shockwaves through their ranks. But it was the mention of another corrupt officer that kept Jacob on edge. As the night wore on, Jacob sat at his desk, reviewing the evidence they'd gathered. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You're playing a dangerous game, Carter. Watch your back." Jacob stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Whoever had sent the message wasn't bluffing. The fight was far from over, and the stakes were higher than ever. Jacob sat at his desk, the ominous text glowing on his phone screen. The words felt like a direct challenge, one he wasn't about to ignore. But he knew better than to act impulsively. Whoever sent the message wanted to rattle him, to make him slip. Instead, Jacob forwarded the text to Rivera with a brief note. "Trace this number. It's connected to the cartel." He locked his phone and leaned back in his chair, staring at the caseboard in front of him. Photos of Alvarez, Brody, and other cartel members were pinned alongside maps and intelligence reports. A question mark loomed large in Jacob's mind. Who was the mole? The mole wasn't just leaking information, they were actively sabotaging the investigation. Morales' tip about another corrupt officer wasn't just a warning, it was a time bomb. Across town, Brody sat in the shadows of a dingy motel room, a burner phone clutched in his hand. His jaw was tight, his mind racing. The cartel had kept their word, breaking him out of custody, but their help came with a price. A knock on the door startled him. Brody grabbed his gun and moved cautiously toward the peephole. On the other side was the same suited man who had visited him in the holding cell. Brody hesitated before opening the door. "What do you want now?" Brody asked, his voice a mix of anger and fear. The man stepped inside, his expression cold. "You didn't follow my instructions." "I didn't have time." Brody snapped. "They were closing in on me." The man's eyes narrowed. "You think that excuses your incompetence? Alvarez is in custody, and now we're exposed." Brody's hand tightened on the gun at his side. "I didn't sign up for this. You said you'd protect me." The man smirked, his calm demeanor unnerving. "And I am. But if you want to stay alive, you'll follow orders." Brody glared at him but didn't argue. He was trapped, and they both knew it. Back at the DEA office, Rivera burst into Jacob's office, holding a file. "We got a hit on the number," Rivera said, tossing the file onto Jacob's desk. "It's linked to a shell company used by the cartel. But here's the kicker, guess who the company's registered under?" Jacob opened the file, his eyes scanning the document. His stomach dropped when he saw the name. "Captain Richards," Jacob muttered, disbelief evident in his tone. Rivera nodded grimly. "The guy who oversees Brody's precinct." Jacob's mind raced. Captain Richards was known as a by-the-book officer, respected by his peers and a visible leader in the community. If he was involved, it meant the corruption ran deeper than they thought. "Does he know we're on to him?" Jacob asked. Rivera shook his head. "Not yet. But if he's the mole, it explains how the cartel always seems a step ahead." Jacob clenched his jaw. "We need to take him down. Quietly. If Richards realizes we're coming, he'll destroy any evidence." Rivera leaned forward, his tone serious. "This is delicate. If Richards is as connected as we think, one wrong move could blow the entire operation." Jacob nodded. "Then we play it smart." The next day, Jacob and Rivera devised a plan to trap Richards. Using the intel from the shell company, they arranged a fake meeting at a warehouse the cartel frequently used. The idea was simple: lure Richards to the site under the pretense of a cartel operation and catch him in the act. Jacob's team set up surveillance inside the warehouse, with cameras and microphones hidden in every corner. Ramirez was stationed outside, monitoring the feed. Jacob and Rivera waited in an adjacent room, their weapons ready. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a black SUV pulled up outside the warehouse. Jacob's heart raced as he watched the monitor. Richard stepped out, dressed in civilian clothes, and glanced around before entering the building. "He's here," Ramirez said over the radio. Jacob and Rivera exchanged a look. This was it. Inside the warehouse, Richards moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. He approached a table where fake crates of drugs had been strategically placed. Pulling out his phone, Richards dialed a number. "It's me," Richards said. "I'm at the drop site. Everything looks clear." Jacob listened intently through his earpiece, adrenaline coursing through him. This was the evidence they needed. But then Richards froze, his expression shifting to one of suspicion. "Wait," he said, lowering his voice. "Something's not right." Jacob's stomach dropped. Had they tipped him off? "Move in now," Jacob ordered through the radio. He and Rivera burst into the warehouse, their weapons trained on Richards. The captain raised his hands, a look of calm defiance on his face. "Well, well," Richards said, his tone mocking. "Agent Carter. I wondered how long it would take you to catch up. Drop the phone." Jacob barked. Richards complied, tossing the phone onto the ground. Rivera cuffed him while Jacob inspected the scene. Despite the operation's success, something didn't sit right. Richards was too composed, too smug. "You're awfully calm for someone caught red-handed," Jacob said. Richards smirked. "That's because you're playing checkers while we're playing chess. You think this ends with me?" Jacob's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Richards leaned in, his voice low. "You're in over your head, Carter. The cartel isn't just in the shadows, they're everywhere. And when they're done with you, they'll burn everything you've built to the ground." Jacob clenched his fists, but he didn't let Richards' words rattle him. "We'll see about that." As Richards was escorted out, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the captain was telling the truth. The cartel's network was more extensive than he'd imagined, and their fight was far from over. But Jacob wasn't about to back down. If the cartel wanted a war, they were going to get one. Richard's smug warnings echoed in Jacob's mind as he drove back to the DA office. He knew better than to take the words of a man who'd just been caught betraying his badge at face value, but Richard's calm demeanor and cryptic remarks gnawed at him. If the cartel had infiltrated deeper into law enforcement, or beyond, Jacob's fight had just become a lot more complicated. At the office, Rivera and Ramirez were reviewing the evidence from Richard's arrest. The captain's phone had been confiscated, and its contents were already being analyzed by the tech team. "Anything useful?" Jacob asked, stepping into the briefing room. Rivera shook his head. "Not yet. His phone was wiped remotely as soon as we took him into custody. Whoever he was working with, they're one step ahead." "Of course they are," Jacob muttered, his frustration mounting. "What about Richards? Did he talk?" Ramirez leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Not a word. He's playing the silent game." Jacob clenched his jaw. "Then we'll have to make him talk." In the holding room, Richard sat at a metal table, his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked up as Jacob entered, his expression unreadable. "Agent Carter," Richard said smoothly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Jacob sat across from him, his gaze steady. "Cut the games, Richards. You're caught. The only thing you can control now is how bad it gets for you." Richards chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You think you've won, don't you? You think locking me up solves anything?" "It's a start," Jacob replied. "But we both know there's more to this. Tell me who you're working with, and maybe we can cut you a deal." Richard's smirk widened. "A deal? That's rich coming from you. Do you have any idea what you're up against? The cartel doesn't just operate in back alleys and warehouses. They're in boardrooms, in politics. They have resources you can't even imagine." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "And you're just another pawn in their game?" Richard's expression darkened. "Don't pretend you're better than me, Carter. You think you're untouchable because you have a badge, but the cartel doesn't care about badges. They care about power, and they'll do whatever it takes to protect it." Jacob leaned forward, his voice low. "You're right. They'll do whatever it takes. But so will I. So you have two choices, Richards. Help me take them down, or go down with them." Richard stared at him for a long moment, the tension in the room thick. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not going to win this, Carter. They've already planned for you." Jacob's stomach tightened, but he refused to show it. "We'll see." After leaving the holding room, Jacob met Rivera in the hallway. His colleague's face was grim. "Anything?" Rivera asked. "Nothing useful," Jacob admitted. "He's more interested in playing head games." Rivera sighed. "Then we'll have to dig deeper. The tech team's working on reconstructing the data from his phone. Maybe we'll get lucky." Jacob nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. Richard's words lingered in his mind, feeding his unease. The cartel's reach was extensive, but just how far it stretched was still a mystery. Later that night, Jacob sat in his office, reviewing the intel on Alvarez, Richards, and Brody. His phone buzzed on the desk, breaking his focus. It was a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "Carter. Agent Carter," a distorted voice. Continued, calm and deliberate. "You're making a lot of noise." Jacob stiffened, his grip tightening on the phone. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled, low and chilling. "Someone who doesn't appreciate your interference. You've disrupted our operations, arrested valuable people. But you've also put yourself in a very dangerous position." Jacob leaned forward, his instincts on high alert. "If you think threats are going to stop me, you don't know who you're dealing with." "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," the voice replied. "Jacob Carter, DEA agent, former Marine, devoted family man." Jacob's blood ran cold as the voice continued, now sharper, more personal. "You've got a wife, Vanessa, and 2 kids. What are their names again?" "Oh yes, Kayla and Jordan. Beautiful family. It would be a shame if something happened to them." Jacob's jaw clenched, his heart pounding. "If you come anywhere near my family..." "You'll what?" the voice interrupted. "You can't protect them, Carter. Not from us. Walk away, and they'll be safe. Keep pushing, and you'll find out just how far we're willing to go." The line went dead. Jacob sat frozen for a moment, his mind racing. He immediately grabbed his phone, dialing Vanessa's number. She answered on the second ring. "Hey Jake," she said cheerfully. "Everything okay?" Jacob forced his voice to remain steady. "Are you and the kids at home?" "Yeah, why?" "Lock the doors and windows," Jacob said firmly. "Don't let anyone in unless it's me or someone you trust. I'm sending a team over to keep an eye on the house." Vanessa hesitated, her tone shifting. "Jake, what's going on?" "I'll explain later," Jacob said. "Just do it. Please." "Okay," Vanessa said, her worry evident. "Be careful." Jacob ended the call and immediately contacted Rivera. "We've got a problem," Jacob said, his voice tight. "The cartel just threatened my family." Within the hour, a DEA security team was stationed at Jacob's home, monitoring the property and keeping Vanessa and the kids safe. Jacob felt a small measure of relief, but the anger simmering beneath the surface was impossible to ignore. Rivera joined him in his office, his expression grim. "You know what this means, right?" "They're trying to intimidate me," Jacob said. "They want me to back off." "And if you don't?" Rivera asked. Jacob's gaze was steely. "I'm not backing down." "They want a fight?" "They've got one." Rivera nodded, though his concern was evident. "Just be careful, Jacob. They're not bluffing. If they're willing to go after your family, they'll stop at nothing." Jacob nodded, his resolve hardening. The cartel had crossed a line, and now it was personal. As the night wore on, the tech team finally made a breakthrough with Richard's phone. They recovered fragments of deleted messages and call logs, enough to confirm that Richards had been in regular contact with high-ranking cartel members. One name stood out: Santiago Vargas. Vargas was a notorious cartel leader, known for his ruthlessness and his ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. If Richards had been working directly with Vargas, it meant the cartel's operations were even more entrenched than Jacob had feared. Jacob studied the recovered intel, his mind racing. Vargas wasn't just another cartel leader, he was the key to dismantling their entire network. But going after him would be dangerous, even for someone like Jacob. Rivera entered the room, holding a new report. "We've got a lead on Vargas. He's rumored to be overseeing a shipment in 2 days. Location still unconfirmed, but if we can find it, we'll take him down," Jacob finished. "No matter what it takes." Rivera nodded. "This is big, Carter. If we're going after Vargas, we need to be smart. No mistakes." Jacob's jaw tightened. "There won't be." As he prepared for the mission ahead, Jacob knew the stakes had never been higher. The cartel was playing dirty, but Jacob wasn't about to back down. They had underestimated him, and they were about to find out just how much of a mistake that was. 2 days later, Jacob stood in the command center at the DEA office, reviewing the final plans for the operation. The team had pinpointed the shipment's location, an abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. It was a known cartel hideout, fortified and crawling with armed men. Santiago Vargas was expected to oversee the operation personally. Rivera addressed the task force, his voice firm. "This is the moment we've been waiting for. Vargas is one of the most dangerous cartel leaders we've ever faced. If we take him down, we deal a crippling blow to their operations. But make no mistake, this is going to be a fight." Jacob studied the faces of the agents in the room, their determination mirroring his own. He had pushed for this mission, knowing full well the risks. Vargas wasn't just another target, he was the head of the snake. As the briefing ended, Rivera pulled Jacob aside. "You good?" Rivera asked, his tone quiet but concerned. Jacob nodded. "I've got my family secured, and we've planned for every contingency. This ends tonight." Rivera patted him on the shoulder. "Let's make it count." The convoy of DEA vehicles moved toward the factory under the cover of darkness. The plan was straightforward: surround the facility, breach from multiple points, and apprehend Vargas and his men before they could react. Jacob's team was assigned to the main entrance, where Vargas was expected to oversee the shipment personally. As they approached, the tension in the air was palpable. Through his earpiece, Jacob heard Ramirez give the signal. "All units in position. Breach in 3, 2, 1. The doors to the factory exploded inward as agents stormed the building, weapons drawn. The sound of shouts and gunfire erupted as the cartel's men opened fire, defending their stronghold with everything they had. Jacob led his team through the chaos, his eyes scanning for Vargas. The factory floor was a maze of crates, machinery, and armed men. He moved swiftly, taking cover behind a metal beam and returning fire as cartel gunmen tried to pin them down. "Carter, Vargas is moving toward the upper level," Ramirez shouted through the comms. Jacob spotted the cartel leader in the distance, flanked by 2 heavily armed guards. Vargas was tall and imposing, his presence commanding even in the midst of the chaos. Jacob motioned for his team to follow as he pursued Vargas up a metal staircase. On the upper level, Vargas and his guards reached a makeshift office overlooking the factory floor. Vargas turned to one of his men. "Delay them. I need time." The guard nodded, stepping into the doorway to block the approaching agents. Vargas moved to a table piled with documents and maps, gathering what he could before escaping. Jacob and his team reached the upper level, exchanging gunfire with Vargas guards. One by one, the cartel gunmen fell, but the fight was intense. Jacob took cover behind a metal beam, his mind racing as he strategized. "Ramirez, cover me!" Jacob shouted, breaking from his position and charging toward the office. Inside, Vargas glanced up, his expression calm but calculating. He grabbed a pistol from the table and aimed at Jacob as the agent burst through the door. "You've caused me a lot of trouble, Agent Carter," Vargas said, his voice steady. "But this is where it ends." Jacob raised his weapon, his heart pounding. "Drop the gun, Vargas. It's over." Vargas smirked, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Not yet." Before he could fire, Jacob lunged forward, knocking the gun from Vargas' hand. The 2 men grappled, the fight fierce and unrelenting. Vargas was strong, but Jacob's training gave him the edge. The fight ended abruptly as Jacob slammed Vargas against the wall, cuffing his hands behind his back. Vargas didn't struggle, his composure unbroken. "You think this changes anything?" Vargas said, his voice dripping with disdain. "The cartel will replace me before I even make it to trial." Jacob tightened the cuffs, his jaw clenched. "We'll see." Back on the factory floor, the remaining cartel members were subdued, and the DEA agents began securing the scene. Jacob led Vargas down the staircase, his team surrounding the cartel leader to ensure there were no surprises. As they exited the factory, Vargas glanced at Jacob, his smirk returning. "This is far from over, Agent Carter. You've won a battle, not the war." Jacob ignored him, focusing on getting Vargas into custody. The cartel leader was loaded into an armored vehicle, and Jacob exhaled, the weight of the mission finally sinking in. Back at the DEA office, the atmosphere was electric. The capture of Santiago Vargas was a massive victory, and the team knew it. Rivera approached Jacob, his face breaking into a rare smile. "Hell of a job, Carter," Rivera said. "Vargas is in custody, and the intel we recovered from the factory is a goldmine. We've got names, locations, and operations spanning multiple states." Jacob nodded, though his expression remained serious. "This is a big win, but Vargas was right about one thing. The cartel won't stop. We've got to stay ahead of them." Rivera clapped him on the shoulder. "And we will. But tonight, we celebrate." Jacob allowed himself a small smile, the first in what felt like weeks. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they had struck a critical blow. And that was enough. The glow of the victory was short-lived. The following morning, Jacob's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Ramirez. "We've got a problem. Meet me at the office ASAP." Jacob bolted out of bed, his instincts immediately on high alert. By the time he reached the DEA office, the atmosphere was tense, with agents moving quickly and speaking in hushed tones. "What's going on?" Jacob asked Ramirez as he entered the operations room. Ramirez handed him a file, her face grim. "Someone leaked the details of Vargas' capture. The cartel knows we have him." Jacob flipped through the file, his stomach sinking as he saw surveillance photos of cartel members gathering outside known strongholds. The message was clear: retaliation was imminent. Rivera entered the room, his expression just as grim. "It gets worse. We intercepted chatter suggesting the cartel is targeting our families." Jacob froze, his mind flashing to Vanessa and the kids. "Are they safe?" "We've increased security at all agents' homes," Rivera said. "Your family's under constant surveillance. But you know as well as I do that the cartel doesn't make empty threats." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Then we hit them before they can hit us." The team quickly devised a plan to neutralize the immediate threat. Using the intel recovered during Vargas' capture, they identified 3 key cartel hideouts where retaliation was being organized. The goal was simple: simultaneous raids to dismantle their response before it could escalate. Jacob volunteered to lead the raid on the largest of the 3 targets, a heavily fortified compound in a rural area outside the city. The compound served as a safe house for high-ranking cartel members and was believed to house a significant cache of weapons. "This isn't just about Vargas," Jacob said during the briefing. "The cartel wants to make a statement. We make one first." That evening, the convoy of DEA vehicles rolled toward the compound, the agents inside silent and focused. Jacob's team included Ramirez, Rivera, and a dozen other agents. They knew the risks, but they also knew the stakes. As the convoy approached the compound, Jacob reviewed the plan one last time. The perimeter would be secured by snipers, while the main team breached the gates and moved through the property systematically. Speed and coordination were key. Through his earpiece, Jacob heard the sniper team give the all-clear. "No movement on the perimeter. You're good to go." "Let's move," Jacob said, signaling his team. The agents exited the vehicles, their weapons drawn as they approached the compound under the cover of darkness. Ramirez planted explosives on the gate, stepping back to detonate them with a muffled boom. The team surged forward, entering the compound with precision. Inside, chaos erupted as cartel members scrambled to defend their stronghold. Gunfire rang out, the sharp cracks echoing through the night. Jacob led the charge, his movement swift and deliberate as he took down armed men attempting to block their advance. "Second floor clear." Ramirez shouted over the comms. "Basement secure," another agent reported. Jacob moved through the compound's main hallway, his eyes scanning for any signs of the cartel's leadership. He kicked open a door at the end of the hall, revealing a room filled with maps, documents, and a table piled with cash and weapons. "This is Command Central," Jacob muttered, signaling for the team to secure the room. As agents began collecting evidence, Jacob's attention was drawn to a laptop on the table. Its screen displayed a live feed from a camera. Jacob frowned, leaning closer to examine the feed. His heart sank when he realized what he was looking at: the front of his house. "Ramirez, Rivera." Jacob barked into his radio. "They've got eyes on my family." Jacob sprinted out of the compound, his mind racing as he called Vanessa. She answered immediately, her voice trembling. "Jacob, there's a car parked across the street. The security team says it's nothing, but I don't feel right about it." "Stay inside, lock all the doors and windows," Jacob said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm on my way." Rivera intercepted him outside the compound. "What's going on?" "They're watching my family," Jacob said, jumping into his car. "I'm not waiting to find out what they're planning." "I'll follow," Rivera said, climbing into another vehicle. By the time Jacob reached his neighborhood, adrenaline was coursing through his veins. He parked a block away, moving cautiously toward his house. Rivera's car pulled up behind him, and the 2 agents approached together. Through the scope of his rifle, Rivera scanned the street. "There's the car," he said, nodding toward a black sedan parked near the corner. No visible movement. Jacob nodded, his focus razor-sharp. "Cover me. I'm going in." He moved quickly and quietly, slipping through the side yard and entering the house through the back door. Inside, Vanessa and the kids were huddled in the living room, their faces pale but composed. "Daddy!" Kayla cried, running toward him. Jacob knelt, hugging her tightly. It's okay, baby. I'm here. Jacob, Vanessa said, her voice shaking. What's happening? It's under control, Jacob assured her, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Stay here. Don't move. He moved to the front of the house, peeking through the curtains at the black sedan. It hadn't moved, but Jacob's instincts told him the occupants weren't just watching, they were waiting. Rivera, any movement? Jacob asked through his earpiece. Negative, Rivera replied. But something feels off. Jacob nodded. It was too quiet. Too still. Suddenly, the car door opened, and a man stepped out, holding something in his hand. Jacob's blood ran cold as he realized what it was, a Molotov cocktail. They're trying to smoke us out. Jacob yelled into his radio. Rivera didn't wait. A single shot rang out, the man dropping before he could ignite the Molotov. The sedan roared to life, its tires screeching as it sped away. Jacob bolted outside, Rivera joining him as they fired at the fleeing vehicle. The sedan swerved but disappeared around the corner before they could stop it. Jacob stood in the street, his chest heaving as the reality of what had just happened sank in. The cartel had come for his family, and they would be back. Rivera placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. We need to end this, Carter. For good. Jacob nodded, his jaw tight. They just made it personal. Jacob paced in the DEA command center, his fists clenched as he listened to Rivera and Ramirez lay out the plan. The attack on his family had pushed him to the edge, but it had also sharpened his focus. This wasn't just about dismantling the cartel anymore, it was about protecting everything he held dear. The cartel's retaliation forces are regrouping at their main stronghold, Ramirez said, pointing to a satellite image of a sprawling estate in the countryside. This is where Vargas' top lieutenants are holed up, and they've brought reinforcements. It's heavily guarded, but if we hit them hard enough, we can cripple their operations for good. Rivera nodded. This is it. We take out their leadership, secure their records, and cut the head off the snake. But it's going to be risky. Jacob's gaze was steely. I don't care about the risks. We finish this. The convoy of DEA vehicles rolled toward the estate under the cover of night. Jacob sat in the lead vehicle, his weapon ready, his mind racing with the stakes of the operation. He had personally ensured that his family was moved to a secure location, guarded by a team he trusted implicitly. Still, the cartel's reach haunted him. This is the last stand, Rivera said, breaking the silence. You good? Jacob nodded. More than ready. The estate was a fortress, surrounded by high walls, guard towers, and armed men patrolling the perimeter. The DEA's plan was meticulous, simultaneous breaches at multiple points to overwhelm the cartel's defenses. As they approached, the team's sniper radioed in. We've got visual. Heavy activity on the ground. Looks like they're preparing for an attack. They know we're coming, Jacob muttered. Doesn't matter, Rivera said. We've got the element of surprise. Jacob and Ramirez led the main assault team, while Rivera coordinated from a mobile command unit. The moment the gates were breached, chaos erupted. Gunfire lit up the night as DEA agents and cartel gunmen clashed across the estate. Inside the estate, Jacob moved with precision, taking down guards and clearing rooms as he pushed toward the main house. He knew Vargas lieutenants were the key to dismantling the cartel's operations, and he was determined to bring them in alive. Through his earpiece, Rivera's voice crackled. Carter, the main office is on the second floor. That's where the leadership's holed up. Jacob motioned for Ramirez to follow as they ascended the grand staircase. The gunfire intensified as they approached the office, but Jacob's focus never wavered. Reaching the door, Jacob kicked it open, his weapon drawn. Inside, 3 of Vargas' top lieutenants were gathered around a table covered in maps and cash. They froze as Jacob and Ramirez stormed in. Hands up. Don't move. Jacob barked. One of the men reached for a weapon, but Jacob was faster, firing a warning shot that grazed the man's arm. The others complied, raising their hands as DEA agents flooded the room to secure the scene. As the lieutenants were escorted out, Jacob's attention was drawn to a safe in the corner of the office. Ramirez worked quickly to crack it open, revealing a trove of documents, ledgers, and electronic devices. This is it, Ramirez said, pulling out a laptop. Bank accounts, supply routes, everything we need to shut them down. Jacob nodded. Get it to Rivera. Now. The operation continued for hours as the DEA swept through the estate, securing weapons caches and apprehending cartel members. By dawn, the estate was under DEA control, its defenses dismantled and its leadership in custody. Jacob stood in the courtyard, watching as the last of the prisoners were loaded into vehicles. Rivera approached, his expression one of exhaustion and satisfaction. "We did it," Rivera said. "This is the biggest blow the cartel's taken in years." Jacob nodded, though his expression remained serious. "It's a victory, but we're not done. We use what we've gathered here to take down the rest of their network. No loose ends." Rivera smiled faintly. "You've got the fight in you, Carter. They picked the wrong guy to mess with." Later that day, Jacob returned to the secure location where Vanessa and the kids had been taken. He found them in a small house surrounded by agents, their faces lighting up when they saw him. "Daddy." Kayla and Jordan ran to him, wrapping their arms around his legs. Vanessa approached, her eyes filled with relief. "Is it over?" Jacob knelt, pulling them all into a tight embrace. "Not completely. But we're safe now. And I'll make sure it stays that way." In the days that followed, the DEA used the evidence from the estate to dismantle the cartel's operations across the region. Vargas lieutenants cooperated, providing information that led to more arrests and seizures. The cartel's power was broken, its leadership scattered. For Jacob, the victory was bittersweet. He knew the fight against crime and corruption was never truly over, but for now, his family was safe, and justice had been served. As he sat on the porch of his home, watching his kids play in the yard, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The cartel had underestimated him, but Jacob Carter had proven that some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost.